I'm Esra Akcan, and today I'm very happy to launch the Cornell Institute for European Studies Migrations Series with Kader Konuk's lecture. Conceptualizes the migration of not only people, but also images, words, ideas, technologies, objects, information, food, and so on. This event series aims to unpack the historical and contemporary relevance of migration in writing global histories and understanding the present. It also aims to put Europe in its global context by discussing the continent as a place of both arrival and departure. This will critically acknowledge European countries' role in the history of modernization and colonization of other countries within or outside Europe, and disclose the region's character as an immigrant continent and diaspora of various peoples. The lectures and panels that will be part of the series throughout this year and the next will hopefully include themes such as academic freedom and exile, migration, automation and employment, migration of images, migration of words, the immigrant continent, crossing the Mediterranean, and so on. So as part of this series, today's event looks particularly on the concept of exile forced by violations of freedom of speech and academic freedom. Turkey had hosted a significant number of exiles after the rise of National Socialism in Germany, who had received important posts in universities and the country's programs during the early Republican period. Today, many exiled academics are seeking positions in Germany with the support of Scholars at Risk and similar programs. Is that okay? Due to the violations of academic freedom in Turkey. So the reciprocity created by these two periods of the same two countries is indeed striking. Kader Konuk will discuss the history and current threats to academic freedom in Turkey by drawing from her seminal and award-winning book, East-West Mimesis, Auerbach in Turkey. In this book, she investigated the relationship between German Jewish exile and the modernization of humanities in Turkey. So just to give some biographical information, Kader Konuk is professor and chair of Turkish studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. Between 2001 and 2013, she was assistant and then associate professor of comparative literature and German studies at the University of Michigan. Trained as a comparatist in German, Turkish, and English literature, Kader Konuk focuses on the disciplinary nexus between literary criticism, cultural studies, and cultural history. Her research is situated at the intersections between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, beginning with the Ottoman modernization reforms and continuing on to the Turkish-German relations in the 21st century. Her work examines cultural practices that evolve in the context of East-West relations, such as ambassadorial missions, travel, migration, and exile. Her monograph, East-West Mimesis, Auerbach in Turkey, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2010, this book won the prizes for the best book in both of her disciplines. It was selected for the René Velek Prize by the American Comparative Literature Association and the DAAD Award by the German Studies Association. In this book, Kader discusses Auerbach in the context of the collaboration between Jewish and leftist émigré academics from Germany and the Turkish reformers who founded universities as secular, autonomous institutions and established new disciplines during the 1930s and 40s. Her book was a deep investigation of the connections between exile, critical thinking, academic freedom, and the history of universities, which, with an unfortunate twist of direction, is all the more relevant today when the flight of scholars, this time to Europe, is concerned. So increasingly, scholars from Turkey and countries in the Middle East or West Asia are seeking refuge in Europe. In the face of repression in Turkey, in 2017 alone, hundreds of scholars have sought possibilities for continuing their critical work abroad. To give an example of some numbers, by June of this year, the number of academics who had signed the peace petition of January 2016 and who were therefore removed and banned from public service with the decree laws, dismissal, resignation, and forced retirement reached 452. Those under disciplinary investigation, 500. The total number of higher education academics who had been purged after the coup d'etat or a coup attempt last year is well over 5,000 and increasing. So, interested in what Edward Saeed once termed the executive value of exile, Konuk asks, the current flight of academics begs the question of how to respond to the crisis other than in terms of the humanitarian aid. By way of an answer, she will lay out her plan for the Academy in Exile, an institution that she recently founded in Germany, and one that will facilitate new forms of knowledge transfer between Turkey, Europe, and beyond. So, as the quick decline of civil liberties continues in many places around the world, as immigrants are being displaced and stripped of their long-established lives in this country, and as countries are subject to travel ban and such things, it seems that the discussion on the concept of exile and the academy is timely. So please welcome.
Thank you very much for introducing me so graciously, Esra'cığım. It is really an honor to be here. It's my first time here at Cornell University, and it's lovely to see Leslie Edison in the audience, who've come to visit Michigan many times, and I'm really happy to be here and see also the graduate student that I've briefly met at the Berlin workshop, which was so impressive just 10 days ago, I think. And so you've gotten over your jet lag and have already continued your studies with Esra and Iftikhar, and I'm really grateful to be able to be part of this discussion and opening the lecture series. So thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today, and thank you to Jason, of course, and Claire for organizing my trip. My talk today is about 45 minutes and has about, I think, 5 parts. So first I talk about the current crisis as it has developed in the past 2 years specifically. Then I'll get into the historical legacy about the German Jewish exile in Turkey, but only briefly to just give you a kind of historical depth about the forms of forced migration that I continue to work on. I'll talk then specifically about the Academics for Peace, the ones who've signed the peace petition in January 2016 that Esra has already alluded to, and then get into some more conceptual thinking about the figure of exile before I give you an idea of what the Academy in Exile is all about, that we've just founded last week in Berlin. In many countries around the world, critics of authoritarian regimes have their civil liberties curtailed. They are subject to arbitrary, often indefinite detention, solitary confinement, torture, and other acts of violence. Speaking truth to power poses an intolerable threat to despotic regimes that regulate information flow so as to maintain control. We have grown almost too accustomed to the vulnerability of journalists, activists, and writers who challenge such regimes. We half expect a pro-democracy advocate like Liu Xiaobo to wind up in jail and his wife to be put under house arrest. We are saddened but unsurprised when a writer in Bangladesh or Pakistan is subject to mob violence while the police look on. What we perhaps don't expect is that academics working on seemingly innocuous topics in ostensibly liberal countries may meet similar fates: intimidation, extradition, incarceration, and state-directed and state-sponsored violence. And I'll just give you just some ideas about the numbers of people who are forced to leave their homes today. But I won't specifically talk about it, but just to have that present in our mind. Whether openly critical of authoritarian governments or not, the higher education community is a new target of repression. And as I want to point out today, globally, academics are increasingly under attack. The Scholars at Risk Network is one of a few major organizations monitoring the growing threat to scholars around the world. This international network of higher education institutions, associations, and individuals works to protect scholars and to promote academic freedom. And there's, of course, also the Scholar Rescue Fund and its British counterpart, CARA, that act as advocates for threatened scholars and seek host universities in countries that protect civil liberties. But even in the so-called free world, academic communities are challenged as elitist and democratically elected governments are interfering with research agendas. This is partly due to the fact that state universities are vibrant interlocutors for democratic processes. Those of us who work in public institutions are particularly accountable to the public. But in an era of post-truth politics and the active dispersal of misinformation, we are all called upon to protect educational institutions, to foster inquiry and produce reliable knowledge. We need to remind ourselves that universities play a key role as vehicles for democracy and healthy public discourse. According to Scholars at Risk, most applications to the organization in the past 2 years have originated in Turkey, suggesting that Turkish academics are currently the most threatened group of scholars worldwide. The actions of the Turkish state do not comply with its human rights obligations, including those relating to freedom of association, due process, and academic freedom. These rights are protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Turkey is actually a party. During the past 2 years, thousands of regime critics have been criminalized, imprisoned, and banned from their profession in Turkey. Without the possibility of being employed, hundreds of scholars have left the country to continue their critical work abroad and actually for living in safety. I believe that what is happening in Turkey is not a national problem. It's also not just a problem of Islam, but one that concerns us all. Turkey occupies a central role in the world because it is the first secular community of a country with a predominantly Muslim population. Republican, democratic Turkey has been, if you like, a bulwark in the struggle for liberal humanism in the Middle East. During the past 2 decades, however, this powerful secular tradition has been dismantled bit by bit. I have reservations about the nationalist underpinnings of secularism in Turkey and the interpretation of the French laïcité into the Turkish constitution. Yet, however critical one might be of the interpretation of secularism within the Turkish context, it is important to recognize that the recent rise of religious fundamentalism and political Islam has put a stay on the secularization of Turkish society and profoundly impacted academia. The erosion of secular education could already be observed in 2009, when the Turkish Scientific and Technological Research Council, TÜBİTAK, censored an issue of the science journal Bilim ve Teknik on Darwin's theory of evolution. The council fired the journal editor, arguing that the Darwin issue was too controversial for the country's political climate. So on the left side, you see the issue that had been planned, and on the right side, you see the issue that was replaced, which is on climate change, global climate change. That was 2009 already. It was a clear sign of what was going to come. TÜBİTAK, the Turkish Scientific and Technological Research Council, as well as other academic and educational institutions, have since come under tighter control of the AKP government, the Justice and the Development Party that runs the country, has been running the country for the past 15 years. Just so that you know that people don't just accept what Erdogan is doing. This might not be possible to publish today, but in 2009, this is one of the significant or the leading cartoon journals in Turkey, and this is, I don't think that I need to explain what's happening there. But 3 months ago, the government went a step further and announced that the theory of evolution was to be dropped from school curricula altogether. The chair of the Board of Education, a theologian appointed after last year's coup attempt, insists that evolution is controversial and not an appropriate topic for the school curriculum. So I keep on finding these references that something is too controversial for Turkish society, as if Islam is not ready to be able to talk about these things, forgetting that it has been the hub for many of these discussions about the progress of science. Instead, the board decided to expand Islamic education in schools. So the next generation of children that will come out of these schools will be those who will be in a few years have a much more fundamental religious education, will not have heard about the theory of evolution, and come into universities that are not ready, or will probably still be censored in a way that won't be, so that the space for thinking of free inquiry will be shrinking more and more. The government is systematically eradicating the secular foundation of Turkey's democracy and along with it, academic freedom, a cornerstone for any dynamic society open to the advancement of knowledge. And the result? The exile of hundreds of academics, journalists, writers, and artists to Western Europe and North America, and a massive brain drain, a hemorrhage of some of the best and brightest from Turkey. While Turkey is the focus of my talk today, it is worth pointing out that the erosion of academic freedom is not just symptomatic of the rise of political Islam. Examples from countries other than Turkey are perhaps less comprehensive in their verbal assault on academic freedom, but nonetheless equally symptomatic of the current conjuncture. The Russian government accused the Center for Independent Social Research in St. Petersburg last year, I think, of acting as a foreign agent. And there's now a branch of the Center for Independent Social Research in Berlin funded by the German government. The Russian government also targeted the European University at St. Petersburg itself, a distinguished private graduate school founded at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. By revoking its teaching license, the Russian government endangers the future of the university, and I don't think that there are any other plans but trying to get back to the teaching license that was revoked. We see the same happening in other countries in Europe as well. Earlier this year, the Central European University in Hungary, an American-Hungarian institution funded by Soros, with the aim of promoting liberal values, has also come under threat. Other initiatives funded by Soros in Eastern Europe are similarly targeted. The former Macedonian prime minister is actually calling for a de-Sorosization of society. Andrea Petu, professor of gender studies at the Central European University, pointed out recently that the entire university might go into exile, and the places that are being discussed right now, it's probably going to be Vienna if the teaching license is not going to be renewed. There's still some negotiations that are, and some people are hopeful, but if not, then the plan is to move the entire university to Vienna. It is generally agreed that the backlash in Russia and Eastern Europe is connected to developments here in the US, where, and I don't need to tell you what Trump has been doing to the NIH, to the National Institute of Health, to climate scientists, and the warnings to UC Berkeley and all of these things that you know better than I. All the signs point to the fact that academic freedom, established as Lehr- and Lernfreiheit at the Humboldt University in the 19th century, is no longer something that we can take for granted. Not only in Turkey, but all over the world, private lives and academic careers are being ruptured by war and revolution, as well as by a populist backlash against academic freedom. Responsible for the growing numbers of scholars seeking refuge abroad are primarily the ongoing conflict in Syria, with its spillover effect on neighboring nation states, the unstable and repressive governments in countries like Egypt and Iraq, and also the outlawing of dissent by democratically elected governments. Academic freedom is under threat because of the rise of populism and authoritarian regimes worldwide. Democracy, once understood as a system that protects the rights of the weakest, has become a tool for the majority to rule over the rest of society. So it has become a tool for demagogues to secure the rule of the majority. For governments that repeatedly invoke the will of the people, academic freedom is construed as the concern of an elitist part of society. Last year's Brexit vote and the presidential election here in the US seem to have triggered a modest flight of academics from the US to Canada, to France, to Switzerland and Germany. So I hear from colleagues and also from governmental representatives in Germany who've been slowly collecting the information. We would not refer to such migrants as refugee scholars, of course, because they are not individually persecuted and their flight is not based on the well-founded fear that is protected under the Geneva Convention of 1951. Nonetheless, US climate scientists are arguably subject to similar tendencies as in authoritarian societies, namely from the anti-scientific stance of populist leaders. The critique of the establishment and academic elitism is a defining feature of populist leaders in the 21st century. Populism translates into the rejection of pluralism and the resentment against the establishment in favor of the will of the people. arguably a populist democracy, represents a degraded form of democracy. Combined with Islamism, however, as can be observed in Turkey in recent years, we see that Islamist populism relegates secular communities to the periphery. Islamist propaganda techniques deemed secularist actually an elitist minority in Turkey. The Turkish government has gone as far as to outlaw and persecute dissent in all forms. President Erdogan closed entire universities after the coup attempt in July last year to minimize the influence of his former ally Fethullah Gülen, who's here in Pennsylvania. But Turkey's AKP regime, in power for the past 15 years, is particularly threatened by secular leftist and Kurdish academics, journalists, artists, and writers who claim the right to the freedom of speech and research. Because of the government's anti-intellectual stance, numerous intellectuals have been imprisoned, silenced, or forced into exile. Just to give you some ideas of and names, Deniz Yücel, for example, is a German-Turkish journalist who works for Die Welt. He's been in jail, I think, for at least 4 months already, and although he also has German citizenship, the German government is unable to get him out of Turkey, and the charges are unclear. I mean, it's clear he conducted once an interview with Abdullah Öcalan and talked about the PKK, which is the guerrilla organization of the Kurdish people, but in times when Erdogan himself was trying to start a dialogue with the Kurds and the rebels himself. So Deniz Yücel has been imprisoned for the past few months already. Aslı Erdoğan, a writer, she's a travel writer and a kind of also postmodern short story writer. She, although she's ill, was imprisoned for at least 3 months. And last week she left Turkey and is now living in exile in Germany. Another example is Can Dündar, the editor of Cumhuriyet, the leading Republican newspaper that is going back to 1923. And Can Dündar was the one who had found out that, or makes the claim, and had also some evidence and photographs published in Cumhuriyet in 2016 already, I think. I think in 2016. And in these photographs, it could be seen that governmental trucks were delivering weapons into Syria and possibly to ISIS. So he was trying to reveal this, and this is why he was charged, imprisoned, got out of prison, and then he fled to Germany. So since then, he's been living in Germany. Doğan Akana is another writer. He writes mainly in Turkish, has been living in Germany for 20 years, and was a month ago charged. He's not really charged, we don't know what the charge is, but he was on holiday in Spain. He only has German citizenship. He already has been living in Germany in exile for more than 2 decades. And he was on holiday in Spain, and Interpol was searching for him. So he's now stuck in Spain, and the German government is trying to get him out so he won't be extradited to Turkey. So examples like these may show you how serious the situation is. It is not possible to predict what the Turkish government is going to go next. They even go after people like Doğan Akanda, who doesn't even have Turkish citizenship anymore. So here Turkey is actually, I think, taking a leaf from the pages of history. Parallels to this crackdown can be found in the McCarthy era, when scholars were subject to political tests and loyalty oaths. Universities were pressured to purge communists, and those charged with communism were dismissed and imprisoned. The fear of communism could be felt on the other side of the Atlantic too. In 1972, the Radikalerlass in West Germany was designed to permanently ban communist academics from universities. This constraint on employment meant the reinstatement of an earlier law, the Berufsbeamtengesetz of 1933, which allowed Hitler to discharge academics on political and racial grounds. The Gleichschaltung, the elimination of opposition, ensured that German academia was purged of Jews and socialists and stood in the service of National Socialist objectives. to the extent that German philologists who served the Nazis developed volumes in the name of the Kriegseinsatz der Geisteswissenschaften, the war service in the humanities, in which they put literature and even literary criticism directly in the service of the war and the idea of a neue geistige Ordnung Europas, a new intellectual foundation for Europe. And those of you who know Carl Schmitt might not be surprised that he was part of this circle. While April 1933 constitutes a moment of unparalleled horror and personal tragedy, it also marks the beginning of a process of intellectual immigration that had a tremendous impact on universities here in the US, in Britain, in Turkey, and elsewhere. The academic refugee organizations of the 1930s shaped the conditions for knowledge production across the disciplines. The Society for the Protection of Science and Learning in the UK, the Notgemeinschaft initiated by Philipp Schwarz in Switzerland, or the concept of the university in exile that was the basis for New School, was integrated into the concept of New School, are prime examples for the impact refugee academics had on the way we have come to think and work today. Against the backdrop of the current flight of academics from Turkey, I want to provide some brief background information on the founding of Turkish universities as secular institutions and the introduction of the concept of academic freedom. The founding of secular institutes of higher education in Turkey was based on the 1924 law for the unification of education, which centralized education. To implement the centralization process, the US philosopher and educational reformer John Dewey, and most of you might know Dewey from the library catalog, the Dewey system, but he was actually a major philosopher and educational reformer. He was invited in 1924 to Ankara in order to look over the plans for the educational reform, the university reforms, and stayed there for 3 months. To him, we owe the phrase, quote, "Since the freedom of mind and freedom of expression are the root of all freedom, to deny freedom in education is a crime against democracy." For Dewey, the freedom of inquiry and the freedom of education were inextricably linked to social change. Dewey considered academic freedom essentially a social issue, since the freedom of teaching and learning was intimately bound up with the success of democracy. I do not yet have specific insights into the discussions that Dewey had with the Ministry of Education during his visit to Turkey in 1924. He was later, the Turkish government invited Albert Malche, a Swiss pedagogue, to look over the Turkish education system, and we have very good documents about it. The reports that Malche wrote, he stayed much longer. But Dewey had an impact. We do know that his reports also helped shape the government's decisions regarding the modernization of education. The establishment of Istanbul University to replace the old Ottoman Darül Fünun in 1933 was a major accomplishment in the reform process. Without the flight of mostly Jewish academics from Germany in 1933, it is impossible to imagine the secularization of Turkish universities and the establishment of new disciplines, be it psychology, philology, or entire branches of the sciences. Émigré scholars played a central role in the formation of an intellectual secular elite that dominated Turkish universities for decades and has now come under attack. In 1933, when Darül Fünun was closed, 2/3 of the faculty was dismissed. So we can already, if we look at the history of dismissals in Turkey, that is the first one, the first major one, intervention into higher education. These faculty members were dismissed because their research and their teaching was seen as to be outdated, too much rooted in the Ottoman education system, and they were replaced mostly by the 40 professors who were hired in 1933 right away. The Berufsbeamtengesetz was issued in April 1933, and when this was exactly the moment, it was only a historical coincidence that Atatürk was looking for European scholars to come and help secularize and modernize the old Ottoman, what was seen as old and outdated religious education system. So there were 40 German professors, mostly Jewish, at Istanbul University from the very beginning, and there were about 42, as far as I remember. I think that was a slightly higher number of Turkish professors at the university. So you can imagine what the dynamic must have been and how much renewal the German scholars initiated in terms of founding departments and coming up with library catalogs. The librarians were hired from Germany as well, who set up the Istanbul University library system. So one can't underestimate the practical and conceptual work that the emigres did in 1933, right away in at Istanbul University, and later other universities were founded, for example, the university in Ankara as well. There is a connection between exile, critical thinking, and academic freedom within the historical context of German and Turkish universities. There is an irony in the fact that scholars are now fleeing Turkey, when historically Turkey was a host to scholars fleeing Europe. Turkey is being Islamicized, and scholars are leaving the country in great numbers. By the same token, Western Europe is concerned about its own secular status. If the historical example is anything to go by, Western Europe's ability today to host current exiles from Islamicization might hinge on a renewed commitment to secularism, or at least religious pluralism. Recapitulating the main ideas related to the modernization of Istanbul University, we can say that the reforms in the 1930s in Turkey were part of a national agenda that linked its success to its capacity to overcome cultural differences between East and West. Humanist worldviews were preserved and transformed as the core of European culture in Turkey, while such views were simultaneously under attack from fascism in Europe. There's, for example, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, one of the most prominent writers of the 1930s and 40s, who does say that Europe is in ruins, and what Turkey is trying to do is to save the humanism that is being attacked by the Nazis. So it's a very conscious effort to keep something alive. Viktor Klemperer, who tried to get the position that eventually Auerbach got at Istanbul University, said that Europe doesn't exist in Germany anymore, but Europe can only continue to exist outside of the European geography. So the idea to take Europe, to emigrate with Europe, you can find this in many letters of the emigres in the 1930s. During the post-war period, however, humanists in Turkey, the Turkish humanists who were actually very close to the Turkish government and working within the Turkish government, lost the kind of influence that they once enjoyed. If there had ever been a window of opportunity for the democratization of cultural politics, this was now effectively closed by autocratic leaders, anti-communist campaigns, attempts to subvert secular education, and a series of disastrous military coups. And I just maybe want to go back to the point of secularism, and what, in a way, for me, that's a very important part of education that needs to be preserved. But as I said in the beginning, I'm critical of secularism per se, because specifically in the Turkish history, the nationalization, the homogenization of the citizens in Turkey goes hand in hand with secularism. So also the idea, the French idea of laïcité, when it was translated into the Turkish context, did not mean that the state and religion are and the religious institutions are strictly separated, as in the French system. But in the Turkish translation of the idea of laïcité, it meant that religion came under the control of the government, of the state. So you have a ministry for religious affairs in Turkey, something that you can't find in the French system, and nonetheless it calls itself a laic system, a secular system. So it is the control of religion through the state that doesn't really make the state a strictly secular one in the French meaning of the word. But nonetheless, I want to hold on to this idea that we need to save the idea of secularism, maybe devoid of nationalism, if it should be a valuable concept to survive. During the transition from the single-party regime to a democratic multi-party system in 1946, Turkey's humanist project ground to a halt. The Minister of Education, Hasan Ali Yücel, who spearheaded the humanist reforms, came under increasing criticism. The system of village institutes, which he had introduced for the training of primary school teachers and promoting a rural intellectual elite, was branded a communist breeding ground. Yücel himself was accused of passing off communism as humanism. Conservatives blamed him for using the cultural reforms to create a Greco-Roman basis for Turkish culture. And you have to think about the historical, the tensions between Greece and Turkey. It was only in 1924 that 1.5 million people were exchanged and forcibly deported along religious lines. So all the Christians who'd been living in the new Turkey had to leave and go to Greece. They were, although some of them did not even speak Greek, were sent to Greece. So if you were an Orthodox, you couldn't get a Turkish citizenship, but were sent to Greece and vice versa. So the exchange, so-called population exchange between Greece and Turkey, was made along religious lines. And then in the 1950s, the anti-Greek campaigns also continued. There were these parallel to a kind of Kristallnacht, all the not all the, but many of the businesses of non-Muslims were attacked in the 1950s. So there is a very strong anti-Greek sentiment in the country since the population exchange. And so to introduce a kind of Greco-Roman humanism into Turkish culture and make that the basis for the new Turkey, of course, was a very contentious thing to do. And it doesn't surprise us, or shouldn't surprise us then, that humanism came to a halt because of the actual anti-Greek climate. In response to this smear campaign against Yücel, he himself mounted a lawsuit on the grounds of slander, and he was actually successful. Nonetheless, he had to retire from his official duties in 1947. But why I'm telling this story is because as a final gesture, before he left his position, was the introduction of the idea of autonomous universities in Turkey. So it is thanks to him that since 1946, universities were founded as autonomous institutions. So academic freedom itself was not introduced as a right protected under the Turkish constitution, but the idea of an autonomous university that was connected to intellectual freedom, we can say that we owe this to Hasan Ali Yücel. But his idea, unfortunately, did not survive for very long. It was first interrupted by the military coup of 1960. The movement of 1968 affected Turkish universities too, as in the US and Germany. The reason for student protests was not an effort to denazify universities, as in Germany, or to protest the Vietnam War, as here in the US, but the dissatisfaction with overcrowded universities and the curtailment of the freedom of speech. Only 8 universities served a population of 35 million in the 1960s and 70s. Deniz Gezmiş, a law student at Istanbul University, who became a revolutionary political activist, embodies the spirit of the late 1960s. He was brought to trial and received a death sentence. His struggle against imperialism and the execution of the death sentence in 1972 turned him into a martyr. I mean, a commodified one today, as you see in the T-shirt. He's a kind of Turkish Che Guevara these days, who has been for a few decades already. Emine Sevgi Özdamar, a young theater actress at the time, went to Germany in self-imposed exile and would later write short stories and a novel titled Seltsame Sterne starren zur Erde, about the movement that was crushed by the military and the effect it had on language. For her, military and state violence contaminated the Turkish language. Here we can discern the echoes of Viktor Klemperer, who was a philologist and survived in Dresden. And in his reflections on the lingua tertii imperia, I think, my Latin is getting weaker and weaker, he had, during the war years, analyzed the way in which the German language was appropriated by the Nazis. So we can hear that kind of echo in what Özdemir is saying about the contamination of the Turkish language. But it is again once history's irony that Özdemir turned away from the Turkish language to embrace the language of Brecht, Kafka, and Else Lasker-Schüler in her own German exile. Despite Deniz Gezmiş's execution, campuses continued to be a breeding ground for student protest movements until the coup in 1980, which is the third coup. This coup had even graver consequences for the freedom of speech. Whereas the universities had been granted autonomy in 1946, in 1982, the Council for Higher Education, Yüksek Öğretim Kurulu, YÖK, we abbreviate it, was founded that from then on centralized and controlled Turkish universities. So that was really the end of the autonomy of Turkish higher education. Thousands of activists, students, and intellectuals were imprisoned, disappeared, or were driven into exile in the 1980s, many of them to Germany. When the democratization process restarted in the 1990s, writers and scholars lifted the veil that had been cast on Turkey's religiously, ethnically, and linguistically diverse past. Once Pandora's box was opened, the pressure to lift the ban on the Kurdish language and to face the atrocities of the Armenian genocide gained momentum. At the same time, however, new forms of Islamism emerged in Turkey as a reaction to secularism. And I'm talking about the Islamism in Turkey not as a movement that tries to introduce Sharia law, at least not openly so. And it's also not necessarily an anti-capitalist, anti-Western form of political Islam. Those of you who followed the AKP government in the past 15 years a bit know that the idea of merging and capitalism with Islam was one of the ideals that Erdogan had. And for a long time, Erdogan was supported by Fethullah Gülen, who also has a kind of pan-Islamic sentiment. The difference between Fethullah Gülen and Erdogan, though, is that although both are ultra-nationalists, Gülen is even more of an ultra-nationalist than Erdogan is. And that's hard to imagine. But both of them only fell out in 2015 when Erdogan started to pick up the dialogue with Kurdish organizations, movements. And the reason why Erdogan did this is because he wanted to prevent the Syrian war and the involvement of Kurds across the border to have a spillover effect in Turkey. And this is why he started the dialogue in 2014 and 15. But Gülen did not go along with Erdogan's aim to win the Kurds over and put them basically into the Muslim boat. The debate now in Turkey is about whether the AKP doesn't want to be called Islamist. They say that they have nothing to do with Islamism. And there are some scholars, AKP, who are close to the AKP, who say that the AKP is more a Muslimist rather than an Islamist party. But to my mind, the AKP represents a proto-nationalist form of Islamism because it draws on belief and the Islamic tradition, but is also deeply nationalist. So it has both of these components. And whether they call themselves Islamists or not does not really is not really important for me. They may have these, debates about gradations between Islamism and Muslimism, but that's a debate that it's not necessarily relevant for when we look at the effect of the politics that it has had. I come back to the present. So one of the groups targeted for persecution in Turkey is a collection of 1,128 scholars known as the Academics for Peace. These scholars signed a peace petition in January 2016, and some of you here in the room have signed it with me. And we appealed to the Turkish government to stop the atrocities against Kurdish civilians in the winter of 2015. So there was a very, very short window where the dialogue between the Turkish government and the Kurds happened in 14 and 15, and then it was basically closed, and when the Syrian war started having this spillover effect. And Kurdish civilians were targeted by the Turkish military in the worst ways imaginable. President Erdogan denounced the scholars, so us as pseudo-intellectuals, and charged us with supporting terrorism. Criminalized by the Turkish state, almost 70 of these peace academics were placed in police custody, and 3 academics were imprisoned who are currently still under trial, facing trial. To date, as Esra said before, 452 scholars have not only been dismissed from their positions, but banned outright from practicing their profession at any institute of higher education in Turkey. All signatories were immediately cut off from state funding and thus have either no or limited means to pursue their research. Bank accounts have recently been confiscated as well in some cases, and colleagues fear that the government will seize their property. And those of the scholars who've left Turkey are threatened with losing their citizenship. They might become stateless. It's one of the threats that Erdogan has articulated in the past months. Self-censorship and the threat of the professional ban affects research and teaching at Turkish universities generally. By issuing a travel ban, forcing all deans to withdraw from their positions in July 2016, cancelling passports of scholars and their spouses, and in Germany we call this Sippenhaft, if you not only punish the person who's, let's say, signed the peace petition, but also the entire family. Turkey is in violation of both academic freedom and the freedom of movement and travel guaranteed by international human rights law. I think the group of graduate students was in Germany when the election happened that weekend, and there were these debates between Merkel and Schulz, the leader of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democratic Party. The television debate between the two of them was for at least 15 minutes. They they discussed whether the European Union should continue their negotiations with Turkey and whether Turkey should ever become part of the European Union. And we've had this debate for the past 50 years already, but it has really come to a point where Germany announced, so the German government announced that they wanted to pull out from these discussions, and so the negotiation has been put on hold. But the one thing that gets forgotten in this process, I think, is that as soon as you discontinue the so-called dialogue or the contact, the involvement in the higher institutions in Turkey, you also, the Turkish scholars who are affected by the persecution, lose a legal ground to go to the European Court. So they have because the academic freedom is not part of the constitutional right in Turkey, it means that every time that all these dismissals can only be revoked if the academics apply to the European Court, which they have done. I forget the number, but I think it's about 150 scholars who've already appealed to the European Court because Turkey is part of the European Union University Association. So as soon as you put that on hold, you will lose the possibility for Turkish scholars to be ever involved and be active as within the academic realm. There are several issues that the signatories face. If they stay in Turkey and want to avoid further persecution, they have to relinquish their academic careers, find another profession, or continue their critical work by circumventing censorship. There are numerous scholars who risk their well-being and safety by continuing to teach outside their former home universities in initiatives that emerged in practically every university town affected by the dismissals. And I just want to give you some photos of the protests. This is not something that circulates in the media, because the media in the meantime is being controlled by the states. So this is only these are only news that circulate in social media. This is a protest at Istanbul University, quite a large one, and I couldn't believe it when I saw the photo in February this year. So Istanbul University was affected by the dismissals. There are only a few universities that have been saved from dismissals so far. This is a case that is getting tragic every day, because this is a literary critic, Nuriye Gülmen, and to the left you see the teacher, Semih Özakça. They both started a hunger strike after they were dismissed in order to protest what was going on. Nuriye Gülmen was actually, she chained herself to the human rights statue in Ankara, in public space, for a long time, and every day she was taken by the police and put into custody, and she would come back and continue her hunger strike. After a while, both of them have been imprisoned. I think they've been in prison for the past 2 months at least. It's been 200 days since the hunger strike, and Nuriye Gülmen has just been, I think 2 days ago, she has been moved into intense care. And I don't know if force-feeding her is more cruel than what has happened so far anyway. This is another, so the resistance doesn't stop in Turkey. That's why I'm showing you these things that, that happen. This is the graduation ceremony at Koç University, one of the private universities that have not been touched by the dismissals yet. The reason why these private universities have been protected so far, I think it's because there are powerful economies behind it, economic interests behind these universities. And also, if Erdogan were to touch Sabancı University, Koç University, Bilgi University, or Boğaziçi, which is a public university, the previous former American college, then the international outrage would be even greater. So in a way, he hasn't touched these elite places, but what's happening in these places that they started censoring themselves. These are 2 students who are protesting what's happening to the professor and the teacher on hunger strike. And the students were not touched by police, but the university disciplined them. This is a protest just in June during the graduation ceremony. What else do I have? This is just came through yesterday. These are the solidarity academies that have been popped up in the university towns where the academics have been dismissed because they have a professional ban and can't just move to another university, can't even teach in schools. They went to mostly the trade unions for teachers, and in these places they started to do teach-ins, to do lecture series, and have plans to be doing online teaching. So although they don't get any income, they try to survive and to keep their dignity as scholars. And for the first time, all these academies, the solidarity academies, put out or have a kind of have started to create a firmer network, and we'll have one in Germany as well. Since early 2016, peace academics have left Turkey, and especially to Germany, 150 of them. That's my estimation. There's no official number, but about 150 of them are in Germany right now. Last June, a group of exiled and German scholars started an initiative to found a peace university in Germany that will promote academic freedom against its clampdown. And I think they're behind the Solidarity Academy that's going to be founded in Germany as well. The signatories do not follow a clear party line against Erdogan. Academics for Peace is not framed by a shared ideology, but by a political and ethical moment, a moral response to the rise of military violence against Turkey's Kurdish population. By signing the peace petition, scholars responded to the call of their consciences. These peace petitioners share a spirit of dissent, but not a political line. Among them, you can find sympathies for the PKK, the Kurdish rebels, as well as secularist Kemalists, or simply pacifist academics. that Erdogan would voice his indignation was within the range of possible outcomes imagined, but the criminalization of this form of dissent could not be foreseen. Academics for Peace has become a useful pawn in Erdogan's polarizing rhetoric against academia, since the signatories sit in the same boat facing slander and material repercussions. They have involuntarily become a political group. Some scholars who have been banned from their profession and remain in Turkey are likely to undergo a process of inner emigration. And that, of course, is a very contested concept for what happened in Germany when German intellectuals under fascism went under, and it's not really clear. There's an ambiguity between open resistance and between the need for self-preservation. So I think what is happening in Turkey is this kind of inner migration, where you don't know anymore how much of it is trying to survive because you don't have any other income. If you say it, you're just waiting for your dismissal to be, your name to be next on the dismissal list. The current flight of academics begs the question of how to respond to the crisis, other than in humanitarian ways. In the last section of my paper, I want to investigate what Saeed once termed the executive value of exile. What, we might ask, is the redeeming feature of exile today? What can we learn from the past, and how can we respond in ways that could help curtail the rise of anti-academism and populism in the world today? In 1943, Hannah Arendt warned that outlawing the Jewish people in Europe was, quote, closely followed by the outlawing of most European nations. Refugees driven from country to country, she said, represent the vanguard of their peoples if they keep their identity, she wrote. For Arendt, the assimilated Jew was who constantly looked for approval was the counterpart to the conscious pariah who was at the vanguard of their peoples. Traditionally, the figure of the refugee is not necessarily associated with that of exile. As if following a class division, we imagine that the refugee is less educated and the exile or émigré, as they were commonly termed then, to have a valuable cultural and intellectual capital. In fact, Arendt's essay starts by acknowledging that we don't like to be called refugees. We ourselves call each other newcomers or immigrants. She points out that the refugee is understood as, quote, a person driven to seek refuge because of some act committed or some political opinion held, end of quote. According to Arendt, the Jewish community rejects identification with the refugee because, quote, we committed no acts and most of us never dreamt of having any radical opinion, end of quote. In an act of self-criticism, her essay restores the identity of the refugee by connecting it to the image of the conscious pariah. And you can see these very similar debates going on in the Turkish exile community today about the fact that they were not a political party before, that they just signed this peace petition, they just followed their call of their conscience, and nonetheless they are made basically into a political group, and among them are Kurds and Turks, there are Armenians in there, so there's no ethnic, political, or religious line that identifies them as a group, but nonetheless they're subject to the same kind of criminalization of dissent. So these discussions whether one is an immigrant, an émigré, or an exile echo in all these debates that I am witnessing in the past months. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, Edward Said took up the question of the intellectual in exile and gave his well-known Wreath lectures, published in 1993, on displacement and the condition of marginality. Said's interest did not primarily lie in the present, but in the displacement caused by revolutions, fascism, deportation, and genocides in the first half of the 20th century. He was interested in the great masterpieces that Adorno, Auerbach, and Naipaul generated in exile. In Said's view, exilic displacement means for the intellectual being liberated from the usual career and prescribed path. While he did not deny the challenges and hardship of exile, Said, in a vein similar to Arendt's, emphasized the condition of marginality as a potential asset of the intellectual. To Said, the quote, exilic intellectual does not respond to the logic of the conventional, but to the audacity of daring and to representing change, to moving on, not standing still, end of quote. For many contemporary critics, exile represents a state of critical detachment and superior insight that is supposed to arise when intellectuals are expelled from their homes and forced to take up residence elsewhere. It concerns me that this line of thought too readily reduces exile to a mere metaphor for uprootedness. Disconnected from his or her social political context, the exile is coupled with possibilities for cultural transfer and transnational exchange. Too easily does the exilic condition acquire then an almost utopian possibility. The exile is suddenly unencumbered by his or her background, emerging instead as a new mediator between systems, a perspicuous commentator on both the endogenous and indigenous. To me, this view of exile distorts the historical record. This view diminishes the existential plight of people, of those who are expelled, who lose their passports, who lose their livelihoods, even as it elevates the individual case to a paradigm. Against this view of exile qua detachment, I propose a condition of multiple attachments. The task is then to investigate and tease out their implications both for the individual and for the respective societies at large. Rather than merely salvaging the positive in the exilic condition, I ask what it actually means to go into exile and what arises therefrom. Around the same time as Saeed, Giorgio Agamben revisited Arendt's essay, and he even, in 1995, he gave that he used the same title for his own article on refugees. Here, Agamben shows no interest in the question of the intellectual in exile, but discusses the status of the refugee. He sees the refugee as, quote, nothing less than a border concept that radically calls into question the principles of the nation state and, at the same time, helps clear the field for a no longer delayable renewal of categories, end of quote. The background that informs Agamben's reevaluation of the status of the refugee is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the outbreak of ethnic violence in former Yugoslavia. Rather than romanticizing the potential of the refugee, Arendt's conscious pariah, Agamben calls for reconstructing our political philosophy, beginning with this unique figure, he says. Perhaps our task today should be to reconstruct our idea of academic freedom and the role of universities via the figure of the refugee academic. By inquiring into the ways in which we conceptualized the exilic intellectual throughout the 20th century to the present, there is an opportunity to understand the conditions that have brought us to this juncture and reevaluate the premises of our profession. Historicizing the figure of the refugee academic that has been called exile, émigré, refugee, expatriate, conscious pariah, or as is the trend now, simply at risk, might shed light on the uneasy marriage between nation states and universities. And I think that is the real problem that needs to be tackled. The relationship between exile and scholarship in the present demands us to rethink the paradigms for exile studies in light of the current brain drain from Turkey and the Middle East. Connecting exile studies to the burgeoning field of refugee studies promises to overcome the conventional class divide and produce more insights into the range and reasons of forced migration. Because what I see specifically in Germany is, since the arrival of almost 1 million refugees in 2015, is that they are treated quite differently under the premises of the asylum law, whereas the academics who arrive in Germany usually don't apply for asylum. They try to avoid becoming an asylum seeker, and even if many of them actually work on migration issues, have worked on the 3 million Syrian refugees that live in Turkey, they're quite reluctant, even if they have emigrated themselves, to see themselves as part of the same route of forced deportation that I think is happening. So there's a kind of intellectual resistance to seeing that they're part of the same crisis in the Middle East that has pushed all these people in different directions. There's also, if you look at the Philipp Schwarz initiatives you might have heard about that has been created in Germany as part of the Scholars at Risk organization at this house at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. They have supported refugee academics or scholars at risk for the past, I think now 1.5 years. There have been 3 rounds where stipends have been given since 2016. There have been 3 rounds. I think we're waiting for the 4th round. And every time 25 scholars can get a stipend and stay in Germany for 2 years. And that program is seen as something different than all the other refugee programs that the German government has started. And I see there is a real problem, because if you don't really bring these different profiles of emigres, whatever you want to call them, together, you can't really address what is really happening in the Middle East. There are barely any Syrian refugees that have come through the Philipp Schwarz program. Half of the stipends were given to Turkish scholars because they are the most threatened in the world today, but also probably, this is not something that I can verify with numbers and with going back to documents yet, but what I've been hearing is that it's mostly Syrian journalists and artists who try to seek exile. It's less so that academics seek exile. So there's a different profile that's coming, different kinds of intellectuals that have been coming from Syria to Germany. They more easily connect with the already existing Arabic exilic community and are separate from the new Turkish arrivees. And my attempt is to bring together, to have a discussion about, although we are all concerned with the same issues, there is a kind of class division, I believe, in the Middle East between Arabs and Turks, and between the refugee who's had to take the boat and the intellectual, of some of whom also had to take a boat because their passports were banned, but most of them have been able to leave Turkey through other means. And we need to bridge this gap in order to be able to talk more productively about the changes that this kind of influx into Europe is bringing, and also to tease out the potential. So exile studies in Germany as well as abroad has been mainly, of course, been dominated by the themes that the Jewish emigration has brought to the table. And there's, for example, the Forschungsstelle, the research institution in Hamburg about exile literature that basically only looks at German exile in terms of 1933 to 1945, and then will end there. What I would like to initiate is a way of thinking about exile in Germany as well as exile from the emigration from Germany as well as the emigration into Germany, and to bring those two movements into conversation, because I find that some of these figures and tropes of exile, the discussions, the debates, the contestations about these issues, really, they are not the same. But there are some repetitions that are worthy to discuss and to investigate further. So my plea is to look beyond 45 in terms of exile studies in Germany, and to connect it to the burgeoning field of refugee studies today. As a response to the current brain drain, and I'll just try to finish here now, as Esra said in the beginning, I applied for a substantial grant from the Volkswagen Foundation to start an academy in exile for scholars who fled to Germany. We just founded the academy last week, so we had the first constitutional meetings. And the idea is not to just give out stipends to threatened scholars or scholars at risk, however you want to call them, but to actually include the exiles themselves into the making of the academy, to make them part of that structure, so that not we German scholars who have their comfortable tenured positions decide on how the exile is going to be to become productive, but to actually incorporate them as their agents of their own exile. This has sometimes happened in the German Jewish emigration, that academics themselves were a part of the structures that were initiated in order to help more people to get out of the country. And following that idea to not look at the refugee academic as a victim, but as somebody who can be an agent of their own exile, is what is behind this academy and makes it different from just giving out stipends for humanitarian reasons. So the idea is to create an academy that is also there in order to discuss what is happening outside of Turkey, to address how academic freedom is a shrinking space globally, and to bring into conversation what's happening in Hungary, in Russia, and the US, and how Brexit affects the exchange of students across Europe. All these questions into one realm in order to be able to address what we need to do, what we need to do next. So instead of just merely being an advocate for exile scholars, the exiled scholars themselves are part of the committee that will set the agenda, the research agenda for the academy, and also select the next round of scholars who are going to get stipends. Come to my last paragraph. Since the study of intellectual exile in the 21st century necessitates the wider study of refugees and other forms of migrations, the Academy will initiate joint networks to connect exile studies with the field of refugee studies. It will encourage inquiry into the forced migration of the intellectual and the political activist, as well as the politically disenfranchised and illiterate. Questions about the transfer of knowledge, the formation of diasporas, the definition of exile, and the building of transnational political networks are pertinent to respond to the increasingly Islamist, populist, or other authoritative states. And I just end with a quote from Brecht, a poem he wrote in exile. Thoughts about the length of exile is the title of this poem, in which he describes that every day you work on the liberation while you're sitting in your chamber. Who's a good translator here? And it's basically a reflection about what other people think about the work that he's producing in his little chamber in exile. And then he talks, in the beginning of the poem, he already talks about the uselessness of putting a jacket on, hanging it up on a coat hanger, or to water a chestnut tree that's outside of his chamber. And I just want to close with these words. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry, I can't deliver good news.
Would you like to take some questions?
Sure, I'd love to take questions.
Would you like to moderate?
Yes, I can do that myself too.
Thank you very much. You've come to the right place. Ithaca, as you may not know, is a city of silence. Many people in this room have been involved in bringing silent writers into the. Here's my question. I want to know how seriously you take the parallel between German Jewish exile to the United States and Turkish exile into Germany. And in particular, I would like to know if you think there is going to be a parallel among the Turkish minority in Germany to the extraordinary support that German Jewish exiles received from the Jewish diaspora in the United States.
I think there are different things that are at work here. I'm not saying, I don't want to put everything on the same plane and say history just repeats itself. It's just a different kind of community that is affected today. But let me just start by talking about the parallels of the clampdown that is happening in Turkey today. So the kind of the Gleichschaltung that we know from the Nazi history that started right away in April 1933 with the control over media, over universities, over state agencies. What has happened in Turkey in the past months since the coup attempt that has actually provoked a probably even deeper kind of coup by Erdogan himself is, I see a lot of parallels with what happened in 1933. And I think my plea is to really take it seriously, how an ethnic minority like the Kurds is being criminalized further and further in Turkey, and how the war in Syria is polarizing the country more and more, and the international attention is not... The international attention on what is happening in Turkey is somewhat there, but in Germany there was a long resistance to actually look at the atrocities that are happening in Turkey against the Kurds in the wake of the Syrian war. And because of Germany's interest in keeping the refugees at bay and keeping them in Turkey and stopping them from coming into Europe, has made them last year particularly blind to the fact what is happening to the Kurds in Turkey. So I don't want to exaggerate the parallel between 1933 and 2016. But I think the kind of control that Erdogan exerts and the kind along ethnic and religious lines and political lines has a lot of echoes of what we know has historically happened in 1933. But of course, I see parallels also with the Radikalen Erlass or the McCarthy era. So these are things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about the shrinking space for academic freedom. But I believe your question was even greater than that.
My question was about the reception of German Jewish intellectuals in the United States and the tremendous support they received from the Jewish diaspora in the United States. My question is whether you see a parallel to this in the attitude of the Turkish minority in Germany towards Turkish exiles.
Thank you for putting it more clearly. There is a natural, the route of migration from Turkey to Germany since the 1960s is already there. There are all kinds of infrastructures that inform the exchange, the migration route from Turkey to Germany. So there's already a structure in place in terms of language, in terms of networks, businesses, academics, journalists, who's already there in Turkey that helps, of course, when in this moment when Turkish academics are seeking ways out of Turkey. Then the natural first address they think about is the Turkish diaspora in Germany. But at the same time, there is a very strong divide between the so-called guest workers who came in the 1960s, the first exiles from Turkey who came after the military coup in 1980, and the exiles who are coming now. And the challenge is to bring them into conversation with each other, although the migration route is there, and I think it is a kind of the infrastructure of that migration facilitates the potential and the strength of the current the current influx of Turkish academics. They're not necessarily, they're also divided by class. The first migrants were mostly illiterate. The second group of arrivees were mostly politically persecuted, and the exiles who are coming now are educated in ways that you can't really find in the Turkish-German community today. So there is a class and an intellectual divide, although you're right to assume that the Turkish diaspora is, of course, very helpful in creating and facilitating the immigration. Have I responded to your question?
Thank you so much for your talk. And thank you for what you're doing. Something I always admired about you is just your real sense of political responsibility as an academic. And I think that that is coming out in what you explained about how the exiles are involved in the political constitution of the organization you're creating. I really appreciate that. I have a question about political responsibility in particular, and I don't mean to shift the focus back to our center here in the U.S., but I can't help but think about the fact that you focus mostly on laws or juridical processes at the level of the nation state, and I'm curious a little bit more about the level of the university and thinking about policies that maybe are not enshrining policies but happen as effective practice that force out intellectuals from particular persuasions. In the U.S., I can think of folks like, I think his name's Mark Bray at Dartmouth, who's a non-tenure track faculty member there, who's spoken about Antifa and in support of Antifa and differentiating the violence there from white supremacist violence. And I'm wondering how, and Dartmouth released a statement against this person, so who knows what's going on there. Things like this happen all the time. So I'm wondering what's happening at the level of the university in terms of either official or de facto policies that are just happening by practice, and how does that inform your analysis, whether in the US, in Germany, or in Turkey?
Yeah, although I was at Michigan for 12 years, I really didn't pay much attention, I have to say to my shame, to the way, to the history of academic freedom when it was introduced, how it's protected, how it's connected to the idea of secularism, whether it's devoid from that. I would have to look into this. But my response to your question is more maybe looking, saying that we need to have more transnational university or academic networks. So an internationalization of universities that have been founded on the idea of the nation is one possibility of propelling the democratization process. So as soon as you stop I think mobility is a core is a core issue of any academic. As soon as you, and student as well, so as soon as you constrain the mobility of the academic and stop the international exchange, then to my mind, the academic discourse collapses in that place. So my plea is to against the very common rootedness of universities in the idea of nationhood, is to support more of these transnational networks that allow not only exiles but academics per se to move more freely, so that we have more of a stance against the right-wing populist attack against academic elitism. I think that the mobility is a core issue that needs to be protected, not only the idea of speaking freely in your space, to be able to circulate the ideas, I think, is what needs to be protected. But I do not have an answer about US universities, but in Europe, the European University Association, for example, that Turkey has become a member of, is one possibility in which you see that although some human rights might not be protected by the constitution of a particular nation, by that nation coming into contact and signing up to international conventions, you have a possibility of protecting the human rights in that country. So that is not to be underestimated, the power of these international networks they have on institutions that have been deeply rooted in the nation. So it's a possibility of having, introducing the idea of plurality and to continue to promote democratization through the internationalization of universities. I mean, here in the United States, it's a fact that the influx of the best academics to the US has always been welcomed. It's how universities have always thrived here. That's not necessarily the case in Europe. So it's only been changing through the European Union. And now the whole question is on the table again, and how to protect this kind of mobility that is now coming under attack. So I think these discourses have evolved because of their different historical conditions have evolved in different ways. Mm-hmm.
Because it's not an easy decision to be made, as I said, but also I feel that there's always some form of hope or future to go back, or things will change, or some another form of agency that something might be done in exile. So I don't know how the discussions are taking place in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But at least with the ones who come here and see, and I constantly have that hope in the air, like not hope, not a cautious optimism, but just like an investment in future to go back and things change, or to initiate certain change on them.
Yeah, I think that's why I ended with Brecht's poem about the length of exile, because that is always the question. Is a return possible? And when is that moment going to come? When is the post-Erdogan phase? Is he going to be toppled down with the next election in 2 years? Some people have the hope that it's going to be over and then we'll be back to trying to rebuild the democratic process again. I think a lot is going to be lost, even if he's might not be re-elected in 2 years. Because there's a huge damage that is being done right now. Boğaziçi University has been, as I said before, protected. As you know, your Esra Mungan, of course, one of the signees of the petition, was one of the ones who has been imprisoned and is on trial, but her trial is being deferred all the time. But the Council for Higher Education has been not going through the list and putting the president of Boğaziçi University has not yet delivered the list of peace academics with the names of peace academics to the Council for Higher Education. They're resisting it. So it's one of the few places where it might be possible to continue some kind of idea of free thinking, although I know of at least of two colleagues from Boğaziçi University who, out of protest, have resigned from their positions, a literary critic and a physicist, who've resigned from their position and have decided to live in European exile because they can't bear the idea that the system has become so corrupt that Boğaziçi University might be protected, but it actually is part of a whole system of repression. So they have, out of protest, it's the only two people that I know of who've not waited for the dismissals, but have actually openly protested. But it has not been discussed in news. These were letters sent to the university. They're not being made public. So the length of that exile, who knows how long it's going to be. But I think what is important is to make it as productive as possible, not only because of those individuals and for democracy in Turkey. I think given that Islam is the second largest religion in Europe, and we need this idea of secularism to survive in order to be able to talk about religious pluralism, about diversity, and so on and so forth. There should be a strong interest to support specifically the secular academics in exile in Europe, to integrate them into the European universities in order to have a basis, to have dialogue partners. Germany has done this with St. Petersburg. That was one of the examples that I gave. So when the Ukrainian-Russian conflict broke out, the German government decided to create a space where the regional expertise would be collected in Berlin, and they have dialogue partners for Russia and the Ukraine in Berlin. So these ideas, these are political decisions that are being made and unmade constantly, and with the new government in being perhaps new coalition that we'll have in Germany, we don't know in which direction things will take. But I think one shouldn't think about these exiles as individuals, but in terms of their use, the executive value of exile that Saeed was talking about, also for the coexistence of different religious communities in Europe today. There should be more of an interest, not only giving out stipends for humanitarian use. Please, Lara.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation tonight. I wanted to say first how much I appreciate the conversation you're trying to build between these two waves of migration, especially academic, and I kind of already see the inklings of that in your first book with the Behar family who moved from Turkey to Germany in 1915 and then can't move back when Auerbach is coming to Istanbul. It's kind of devastating and tragic. But I'm wondering on a more practical level how you deal with the category of the academics who remain in Turkey and who will lose their passports if they do end up being fired from their jobs with these decrees, right? That is part of the way that these decrees work. Not only do you lose your job, you also lose your mobility in terms of your national passport. And whether that factors in to an internal distinction of class relation or a degree of precarity between the academics for peace themselves.
There is a sense of guilt that the scholars have who are in Germany right now because they feel they have left their colleagues behind and sometimes their families behind. I know of one case where husband and wife, both scholars, signed the peace petition. She applied for a Schwarz fellowship. She got the Schwarz fellowship to be able to go to Germany, but they were not sure whether they should do it because it meant moving the whole family. Then the decree came, and the decree meant that both husband and wife lost their jobs and had a professional ban immediately, couldn't go back to work the next day. It also meant that within 24 hours, they wouldn't be able to leave Turkey. They decided, it's one of the tragic case, they decided that night, the 14-year-old son said to the mother, "Mother, Anne, if you stay, you have no life. If you go, you have two." And she left. Before the border control knew that her passport was cancelled. She left her husband and two children behind. The children, in the meantime, have come to Germany. They had these incredibly tragic lives. It's not only, I mean, that's where the whole humanitarian issue, of course, comes into play. And the husband can't leave Turkey in the meantime. So that's just the whole family being broken apart shows, of course, is an example of how the sense of guilt is there, of having left your own family, of sense of betrayal is there. And there needs to be, of course, a lot of support in order to be able to overcome those issues. Intellectually, but it's happening in that same place where I don't want to say the names or the place at the university where they were dismissed. The husband started a library with for the dismissed academics in his home university town, where the dismissed academics go and do their teachings. And the idea is that we'll try to find some funding, channel it into the solidarity academies that have emerged everywhere, like little mushrooms. They are places of resistance. So the German government doesn't want to channel direct money into anti-governmental initiatives in Turkey because they're afraid of losing the refugee deal. As soon as Erdogan gives up the refugee deal, it means that the borders will be open and there will be another 1 million refugees coming into Europe, and then there will be another Brexit. So in order to stop that, they're doing this dirty deal with Turkey. At the same time, behind the scenes, what is happening is the German government is basically encouraging foundations, private foundations, this is how the Academy in Exile is coming into being, I think, by the German government seeing what is happening, not being able to say it out loud, but trying to get enough support so that what is happening in Turkey is not going to be the worst case scenario. So these are very delicate negotiations that we have right now with people in the foreign office in Germany and with different foundations. And it's very, very difficult because you can't do it the right way. But it's important to find ways of supporting specifically the solidarity academies, because they are the only spaces where the idea of free thinking is being kept alive. The students from the universities who are still enrolled go there and meet their former professors. There are no credits being given. So the one idea that has come into being is also that this Peace University that was founded in Germany 2 or 3 months ago will come up with an online teaching system and use MOOC in order to be able to do co-teaching with the dismissed professors in Turkey. And that would be amazing if that were to happen, if we were to use a digital platform for academic freedom that surpasses all these national restrictions onto our teaching and research. There are other things that are happening. There was an Armenian genocide conference in Berlin just 2 weeks ago on the weekend. Of course, you were there. So you would know it, but the German ambassador in Ankara was the next day called into the office to the government in Ankara and had to give, had to basically listen to the criticism of why Germany is hosting an Armenian genocide conference, when in 2014 it was possible to have such a conference in Turkey. So times have changed so radically that Pandora's box that was open for about 15, 20 years is so forcibly and violently being closed right now that it's hard to imagine that Turkey was a different place just a few years back, and how important that was for the process of democratization in the Middle East. So we're losing, it's not because I have Turkish background and all kinds of other backgrounds, but we're losing a possibility of a future of Europe if we don't try to create, to build on these little bridges that are still there. Sorry, it doesn't become any better, does it? Go ahead. Yes, you. Shall we collect? Yes, please.
I have a question regarding my university, Bremen University in Germany. We have a graduate school where we are having and had Turkish doctoral students. And one of my supervisors has returned to Turkey. And now I'm wondering, since we have been in a close exchange via email, and she came to conferences until last year only, in June, how open and how much censored is the internet communication now? How much is there a closure, or is there still exchange going on between the exiled communities and the homestayers?
Yeah. It depends on... Oh, we can collect. Sure, let's collect.
Thank you for the fascinating discussion, and especially the historical background. But one point you made is what's different about today is the existence of European-wide institutions, especially ones that are intended to protect individual rights. And you talked about the European Court that might defend rights of academic freedom. I think you're referring to the European Court of Human Rights?
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with it mainly because of rulings against Turkey, against Russia, against Britain for violations of human rights during military conflict. So Turkey in northern Cyprus and against the Kurdish guerrillas. And I've studied more the Russian case, and this is where my question comes up. One issue that has come up for supporters of human rights is when Russia doesn't really accept the rulings that go against it, but it pays the fine, which is the only recourse that the court has, and then it just continues with the same behavior. So in this case, it was in Chechnya and now in Ukraine as well. And so the question has come up. It's not a European Union institution, by the way. It's the Council of Europe institution. And so the question comes up. Both Russia and Turkey are members of the Council of Europe and therefore subject to the court. Neither is a member of the European Union, but Turkey is closer. So the question comes up, should those countries be expelled from the Council of Europe, given that the measures of the court are not apparently having any impact, or are you losing whatever leverage there might be? And so I'm curious about your view. I mean, Turkey might say we don't want the European Union anymore. Would they say we don't want the Council of Europe anymore? Should the Council of Europe say we don't want Turkey anymore, or does that risk losing a little bit of leverage?
These are details. Honestly, I won't be able to judge it properly, and I would have to. My political assessment is we need these tools. If we don't have these tools, there is no way of making these claims. So there's Zeynep Kıvılcım, a legal scholar at Istanbul University who was dismissed. She was in Berlin last October for a conference, and while she was in Berlin with her child, fortunately, she found out that she was dismissed. And she's a human rights lawyer, been teaching human rights at Istanbul University for years already, and has a PhD from the Sorbonne, and a really eminent scholar. And she was the one who explained to me how she's been collecting all these cases in Turkey and trying to make a collective claim. So I think it is a tool by which, at least, even if it doesn't count for anything in Turkey, nobody is going to be put in jail or even charged with anything in Turkey. It gives you the European Union, the tools that the European Union or the Council has, gives you a possibility to articulate the violation of human rights at least, which counts for a lot. Because you can go public, you have the international attention, you can maintain your dignity as a scholar, you can articulate what is meaningful in the Turkish and in the European context. For all those reasons, I think it's important to continue to maintain those links. I think it's silly at this moment that is so harsh and difficult to say that all the negotiation process, the accession talks should be completely put to a halt. Merkel said that she was never for Turkey joining the EU. We heard this from Mitterrand. We heard this from several people over all these decades. But nonetheless, although Turkey never became a European Union member, the negotiation processes in the past 20 years had the effect of democratizing Turkey. And whether it was about copyright law or the University Union Association or many, many other issues that are about civil life, it had a huge effect on how Turkey stands there today. So at least there is a legal structure and a basis to work with. Now that was a direct answer to your question. Going back to yours, and then I'll finish, I promise. PhD student. Okay, so how do I start this? My work has been about, my work on the German Jewish immigration to Turkey has partly also been about anti-Semitism in Turkey. And I never believed that Turkey accepted the German Jewish professionals who came in the 1933 out of humanitarian reasons, but it was a historical coincidence, a possibility that the government used in order to realize their own aims. And by talking about anti-Semitism, this was many, many years back already, I already attracted attention from the Turkish government. And it's really, like, for many of us who work on these issues, we do have to accept that there might be somebody in the audience who's recording what we're saying, that there are files about us that are kept over the years, and there have been interventions. I've been called a liar by a Turkish consulate member while I was giving a talk about anti-Semitism in Turkey. This was a talk I gave in Berlin. I was interrupted by the Turkish consul in Chicago, who came to an event in Michigan where we talked about 500 years of, they wanted to make this whole event about the Sephardic community being hosted by the Ottomans, and wanted to make a big kind of celebration of this event in Michigan. And I was invited, and they didn't really know what I was going to say, but I talked about anti-Semitism. So the Turkish consul, after my talk, he waited until I was done. Without being asked, he was not on the list of people who were supposed to be part of the panel, gets up, takes the podium, and starts renouncing what I've just said. So these are just little examples of somebody like me who works in a very, very protected area like Germany and the US in the past decades. And even by just poking around a tiny bit, it was not even the Armenian genocide that came later that I started doing that. But just doing a little unsettling of these deeply rooted nationalist ways of thinking about that was enough in order to have the sense that I'm being surveilled, possibly. This has become real. In a way, it's not only just sometimes that people come, but we know for sure that they're following us. Everybody who signed the peace petition has a file, and I'm not able to go back to Turkey. So if your PhD student has signed the peace petition, can be certain that he or she has a file. And so those of us who continue to be outspoken, even outside of Turkey, have to even think about the repercussion that we have, even living outside of Turkey. So it is, my emails are probably open books for some people. So are yours. I think that there's no privacy that we were used to, that we grew up with. There's no sense of privacy anymore. But I think it's a political reality. And you just continue what you need to do.
Well, thank you so much for this.